The horse began to tread on the coffin. When the lid broke, everyone had to cry. No one in the small town of Buffalo Ridge could have foreseen the moment when the old mare, Magnolia, would trample over the coffin. The hush that fell across the cemetery was as sharp as the winter wind, and hearts collectively seized when the wood gave way beneath the horse's hooves. It was a moment that would bind them all, neighbors, family, even strangers, in unexpected unity and shared sorrow. This is the story of how one broken coffin lid revealed raw humanity, forging new paths of resilience and hope, and of a daughter who learned the deepest lessons of life through the horse who stomped on her father's final resting place. Evelyn Walker had always known the smell of hay and horse sweat better than the scent of morning dew. She grew up on a modest ranch set against the rolling foothills of the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming. Her childhood days were spent mending fences, feeding animals, and finding comfort in the gentle nicker of her father's favorite mare, Magnolia. The ranch, nestled near Bighorn National Forest, a real place that sprawled across north-central Wyoming, was her entire world. She was 6 when she first clambered onto Magnolia's broad back. Her father, Thomas Walker, had lifted her up with a grin that spoke of pride and possibility. "One day you'll ride her all on your own," he said. He was rugged in that Western way weather, beaten face, calloused hands, and a gentleness in his eyes that revealed who he truly was. He had named the ranch Skyward Oaks, believing that even in Wyoming's wide expanse of plains, one could still look to the sky and find hope in the simplest things. Her mother, Clara, had passed away when Evelyn was just 2. All Evelyn had were stories from Thomas, stories of how Clara's laughter was like birdsong at dawn, how her cooking filled the entire ranch with warmth, and how she brushed Magnolia's mane for hours like it was a sacred ritual. The ranch had once been a place for the 3 of them. After Clara's death, it became a place for 2, and the big bay mare seemed to fill a crucial space, carrying the weight of Evelyn's grief in the gentle sway of her back and the soft breath she exhaled every time Evelyn cried into her mane. Thomas was a devoted father. From sunrise to sunset, he worked the land. He taught Evelyn how to guide an ornery calf back into the herd and how to tie a slip knot that wouldn't come undone no matter how much a restless colt yanked on it. But more than any practical skill, he taught her about respect for the land, the animals, and for people whose stories they barely knew. He often said, "Life out here is tough, Evie, but being tough don't mean you can't be kind." Despite ranch life's hardships, waking up before dawn, scraping together money for repairs, and nursing sick animals, Evelyn found a sense of fulfillment. It was in the softness of Magnolia's muzzle, the call of a hawk circling overhead, the towering pines of the Bighorn National Forest that stood as silent witnesses to each year's changing seasons. And it was in her father's presence that radiated both strength and tenderness. When she turned 10, she rode Magnolia out alone for the first time, traversing the winding trails that led to the edges of Bighorn National Forest. The forest was a living tapestry, tall evergreens, hidden meadows bursting with wildflowers, and occasional deer bounding gracefully through the brush. She felt like an explorer in an endless realm of green and golden light. Thomas had told her stories of how these lands were once roamed by the Crow and the Northern Cheyenne, how the mountains housed both mystery and memory. "You respect that land," he would say. "It's older than any of us, and it has its own tales to tell." At the ranch, life found a rhythm. Summers were hot, with sweaty days spent stacking bales of hay high in the loft of the barn. Winters were brutal, blanketed with thick snow, requiring them to break ice for the cattle to drink. But the changing seasons were like chapters in a familiar book, each one returning with expected challenges and small miracles. There was the miracle of new foals in spring, There was the relief of autumn when the cattle drives ended and everything shimmered with golden light. Magnolia was a constant. The horse was no purebred champion, but her hooves carried the steady drumbeat of a best friend. She was a tall, bay-colored mare with a white star on her forehead, like a patch of snow that never melted. Her dark eyes radiated a calm understanding, as if she could see through human pretenses straight into the heart. Evelyn bonded with her in ways that words could not describe. Perhaps it was because she had a piece of Clara's devotion still lingering in her mane, or because Magnolia was the first creature to make Evelyn laugh after Clara's passing. If the ranch itself was home, Magnolia was the embodiment of home's warmth and soul. And so the ranch life continued year after year. Neighbors came and went, some settling in Buffalo Ridge temporarily, others planting deeper roots. Thomas kept up with them all, ready with a helping hand. He was that kind of man, dependable, a gentle giant who rarely raised his voice unless it was absolutely necessary. He refused to let new arrivals feel unwelcome. If someone needed a horse trailer, he'd lend them his. If someone was short on feed, he'd share from his own stock. These acts of neighborly kindness gave him a reputation throughout Buffalo Ridge. Thomas Walker, the man you could call at midnight and know he'd show up no matter what. Evelyn, meanwhile, blossomed. By her mid-teens, she could perform all ranch chores as adeptly as a seasoned hand. Some evenings, after a full day of manual labor, she'd collapse into bed and stare at the ceiling fan spinning above her, half expecting that if she closed her eyes for a moment, she'd wake up to find it was morning already. Her father told her she worked too hard, but she did it out of love for him and the legacy of their land. She was determined to preserve the place her parents had poured their souls into. But quiet troubles lurked, even as their days seemed outwardly peaceful. Ranching costs money. Ranching, despite its joys, also ushered in anxiety about feed prices, vet bills, machinery repairs, and property taxes that never seemed to relent. Thomas began to experience pains in his joints that slowed him down. He'd hide it with jokes and a stiff upper lip, but Evelyn noticed. She also noticed that lines of worry had carved themselves into his sun-beaten face, and his shoulders slouched more at the end of each day. When she turned 16, she spotted the first real sign of her father's aging, a slight tremble in his hands when he tried to lift a saddle. She offered to take on more responsibilities, hoping to shield him from the heavier labor. Thomas appreciated this, but he also reminded her that a father's greatest desire was to protect his child from life's harshest burdens. "Don't you go thinking you got to carry me on your back," he'd say. "I'm the one supposed to carry you." Evelyn never forgot those words, even though by the time she reached her late teens, it felt as if she was carrying them both. It wasn't a burden she resented. It was simply the reality of loving someone deeply enough to share their struggles. Yet through it all, long days, financial worries, creeping pains, there was the faint glimmer of contentment. Father and daughter found solace in each other's company and in the unwavering presence of Magnolia. On starlit nights, they'd sit on the porch, the wooden planks creaking beneath their rocking chairs, and talk about everything or nothing at all. The faint smell of horse sweat, leather, and sweet grass was the perfume of their life. "We'll make do," Thomas said more than once, staring out into the vast Wyoming sky. "We always have." Those were the days Evelyn would come to cherish the most, days of gentle, unspoken love. Days before fate would bring unexpected sorrow. Days before that terrifying moment in the cemetery, when the horse she adored would unwittingly break the lid of the coffin and shatter hearts in one swift moment. Evelyn turned 20 in the heart of a mild winter. Snow dusted the ranch lands like sugar on a plain loaf of bread, and a soft hush had settled over Buffalo Ridge. She could see her breath in white puffs as she walked alongside Thomas to the barn. Magnolia's greeting nicker was as comforting as a lullaby, and Evelyn ran her fingers through the mare's mane, smiling at the warmth of the horse's body in the cold morning air. By now, Thomas's joint pains had grown worse. His knees no longer cooperated when he had to bend down and check hooves, and sometimes a dull ache spread across his shoulders, rendering him useless for an entire afternoon. Evelyn had insisted he see a doctor in the nearby town of Sheridan, a place large enough to host both a hospital and several clinics. A neighbor, Carl Bishop, loaned them his pickup when their truck's radiator died in a last, dramatic gasp one chilly morning. Thomas only went to the doctor after Evelyn practically begged him. He was stubborn in that way, believing that illness was a weakness to be conquered by willpower. But after the exam, the doctor wore a grave expression. "Thomas," she began, "we need to run some tests. This could be rheumatoid arthritis, or it could be something else. You've got more than just joint pain going on." Evelyn felt her heart hammer in her chest. She was used to the ranch's daily stress, the unpredictability of raising livestock, but this felt like an entirely different storm looming on the horizon. Over the following weeks, they returned for more tests: blood work, X-rays, MRI scans. The constant shuffle to and from the hospital broke the routine of their ranch life. The feed deliveries were left to Evelyn, so were fence repairs and late-night checks on pregnant cattle. Each day she rose earlier and worked later, leaving time only to pick up takeout from a small diner near the hospital so she could see her father after his appointments. She tried to keep her spirits up, making light banter about the daily goings-on back at the ranch. "Magnolia nearly chewed your old hat today," she'd say with a teasing grin. She didn't like the shape of it, I guess. Thomas would give a tired chuckle, but the lines of worry in his face only deepened. Finally, a diagnosis came. The doctors believed it was a severe autoimmune condition, rheumatoid arthritis, complicated by a degenerative joint disease that had likely gone untreated for years. Surgery could help, medication might slow the progression, but there was no reversing it entirely. It was a matter of pain management and adjusting to new limitations. Worst of all, the doctors cautioned that ignoring these limitations could have dangerous consequences. Evelyn's eyes stung with tears when she read the brochures and pamphlets they gave her. She looked at her father, who seemed smaller under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway. He refused to let her see him cry. When they drove home under a sky streaked with pink and gold, Evelyn felt a swirl of emotions: fear for her father's health, worry about the mounting medical bills, and heartbreak at the thought that the man who had been her rock would now need her to be his. Thomas felt it too, though he tried to distract her with talk of the ranch's future. "We'll get through this. Maybe I can train a couple of horses, teach new riders. I won't be doing the heavier work, but I can still be useful," he said, in a voice that had lost some of its old confidence. The first few months after the diagnosis were a test of wills. Thomas tried to keep up with chores, but his body fought him. Some days he would grit his teeth and work through the pain. Other days he would curse at his own knees or shoulders, throwing a wrench across the barn in frustration. Evelyn responded with compassion. She often woke before dawn to feed the livestock, telling Thomas it was fine, that he deserved a few hours' rest. At night, she'd sit with him, pressing a hot water bottle to whichever joint ached the most. Their finances took a hit. The ranch needed constant upkeep, and the cost of medical care gnawed at their savings. The older machinery was prone to breakdowns, and the roof of the barn started leaking after a particularly nasty snowstorm. Evelyn contemplated taking a part-time job in town or selling one of their prized yearlings to make ends meet, but Thomas refused. "We're not selling a single horse," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "We built this place on the backs of good animals. I won't sacrifice one for the sake of a quick dollar. But as the months wore on, it became clear that something would have to give. Even if the ranch could scrape by financially, Thomas's condition was deteriorating more rapidly than expected. Around her 21st birthday, Evelyn caught him struggling to Mount Magnolia for a casual ride around the property. She rushed to help him, but he shooed her away, only to lose his balance and tumble to the dusty ground. He landed with a sharp cry that tore through Evelyn like a knife. She knelt beside him, her heart pounding. When she helped him up, she could see tears trembling in his eyes, more from humiliation than pain. It was a wake-up call. After that day, Thomas confined his riding to slow, safe walks, often with Evelyn by his side in case he needed help dismounting. His frustration grew, and a cloud of sorrow hung over him that even Magnolia's gentle companionship couldn't lift. The mare would amble over to him in the field and lower her head, as if sensing his sadness. He'd rest his hand on her muzzle, stroking softly, muttering words that Evelyn couldn't quite catch. She suspected he was sharing secrets with Magnolia, worries he couldn't bring himself to say aloud to his daughter. Despite the challenges, pockets of beauty and hope remained. The wide Wyoming skies still offered breathtaking sunsets. The land still gave them bountiful hay in the summer. And father and daughter still found laughter, though less frequent in the small moments, like a mischievous pony escaping the corral or a barn cat pouncing on a squeaking mouse. They found resilience in each other, a determination to endure, a bond that felt unbreakable even when tested by pain and fear. But no one can fight fate forever. Another winter came, colder than the last. Thomas's health sank faster than the setting sun. The doctors found more complications, fluid in his lungs, possible infections. His immune system was turning against him in more ways than one. Evelyn tried to remain strong, but each new symptom felt like a hammer striking chinks in her armor. She watched her father's face grow pale, watched him wince whenever he climbed out of bed, watched as the man who had once wrangled rogue stallions now struggled to walk to the barn. One particularly frigid evening, Thomas sat with Evelyn in the living room, both of them wrapped in thick blankets. The fireplace glowed with embers. He reached out a shaky hand and placed it on hers. "Evie," he said softly, "I need you to promise me something." Her heart thudded. Anything. He paused, his gaze drifting to the photographs on the mantel pictures of him, Clara, and a baby, Evelyn. Pictures of the ranch in its early days, the paint on the barn bright and fresh. "Don't ever leave this land," he murmured. "Not unless you're sure it's for something good. This place. Your mother and I put our souls into it. I know it's gotten harder, but promise me you'll try. Keep Magnolia. Keep the horses. Keep the sky overhead and the earth underfoot. Keep living in a way that respects what we built." Tears stung Evelyn's eyes. "I promise," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. She knew what he was really saying, though he wrapped it in gentler words. He was preparing to leave, and he wanted reassurance that she would carry on without him. He pressed a piece of paper into her hand. It was a sketch he'd drawn, shaky but earnest, of the ranch in springtime, complete with a small orchard. He'd always dreamed of planting. "I can't do it," he said, voice trembling, "but maybe you can." That night, as the wind howled outside, Evelyn held her father's hand in silence, absorbing the warmth of the fire and imprinting this moment into her memory. She sensed the chapters of her life turning faster than ever. In the days ahead, her resilience would be tested in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Thomas's health worsened as winter refused to release its icy grip. He was confined indoors more often than not. The ranch's livelihood now rested squarely on Evelyn's shoulders. Neighbors helped in small ways. Carl Bishop hauled feed for her, while the Mitchells from down the road offered to fix the barn's leaky roof at a discount. But the financial strain grew more daunting with every medical bill. One blustery morning, after a night of howling winds, Evelyn found Thomas lying in bed with a fever so high. It seared her palm when she touched his forehead. His breathing was ragged, his skin clammy. He opened his eyes just long enough to tell her not to worry. But Evelyn was already calling for an ambulance. When it arrived, the paramedics had difficulty guiding him down the narrow steps of the old house. He groaned at each jolt, face contorted in pain. Evelyn followed them to Sheridan Hospital, heart pounding as if it would burst. At the hospital, doctors swarmed, hooking him up to IVs, oxygen lines, monitors that beeped with relentless urgency. "He's got pneumonia," one of them said gravely, scanning lab results. His immune system, already compromised, was struggling to fight the infection. "We'll do our best, but it's going to be an uphill battle." Evelyn felt a sense of numbness. She moved like a ghost through the corridors, reading brochures on pneumonia, rheumatoid arthritis, and the complications of chronic illness. She talked with insurance agents, trying to figure out a financial plan. When she wasn't in the waiting room, she was by Thomas's bedside, holding his hand, stroking his hair, praying silently in half-formed sentences. In rare moments of lucidity, he'd look up at her and attempt a reassuring smile. "It'll be okay," he rasped. She nodded, even though tears blurred her vision. The next week was a trial of endurance. Snowstorms swept across Wyoming, making the roads nearly impassable. Evelyn temporarily left the ranch's day-to-day operations to Carl Bishop and a couple of ranch hands who volunteered their time. She slept in a cramped armchair in Thomas's hospital room, wearing the same flannel shirt 3 days in a row. Nurses brought her coffee, and doctors delivered updates that ranged from hopeful to ominous. One evening, his condition improved slightly, enough that he could talk to her without gasping for breath. Another morning, a wave of infection seemed to set him back twice as far. Finally, in the early hours of a bleak, grey dawn, the monitors began their panicked shrieking. Nurses rushed in. A doctor barked orders. Evelyn stood rooted by the door, fear shredding her composure. She caught the phrase, "cardiac arrest," and felt her stomach twist so violently she nearly collapsed. Someone ushered her out into the hallway, but she heard the frantic commotion behind the closed door. Minutes later, minutes that felt like a dark eternity, she heard the wail of an alarm being silenced. A nurse emerged, face pale, eyes downcast. She shook her head gently. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "He's gone." Evelyn's world cracked. She stumbled backward, pressing herself against the cold hospital wall, as if trying to anchor herself in a reality that no longer made sense. Gone. The word echoed like a hollow bell. Everything felt surreal. The bright fluorescent lights, the idle chatter of staff at the nurse's station, the squeak of wheels on a gurney. She recalled a million trivial details: her father's laugh, the crease between his brows when he was worried, how he always put a bit of molasses in his coffee on winter mornings and felt them slip away one by one, as if a door had closed on all those shared memories. They allowed her a moment to see him, to say goodbye. He looked strangely peaceful, almost as if sleeping, but the unnatural stillness of his chest betrayed a finality that shook her core. She held his hand, pressing it to her cheek. It was still warm, but that warmth faded too quickly. She cried in silent, heaving sobs, tears soaking into the sheets. "I love you," she whispered, half hoping he could still hear her. Eventually, hospital staff guided her through a series of paperwork and decisions. Did she want an autopsy? Where would she like his body sent? Had they made funeral arrangements? Evelyn moved through those questions in a haze, as though she were in a dream. The only clarity came when they asked about funeral plans. She recalled her father's final wish to be laid to rest on the ranch. Wyoming law allowed for burial on private property under certain conditions, but she'd also have to consider a funeral home's involvement. In the end, she decided that he deserved to be at Skyward Oaks, the place he'd cherished all his life. Over the next couple of days, Carl Bishop and the other neighbors stepped in. They helped with the arrangements, built a simple coffin, and prepared a burial spot in a quiet patch of land near a tall oak that Thomas had planted for Clara years ago. Evelyn found a local mortician willing to handle the body and preserve it until the day of the funeral. Offers for help poured in from the townsfolk of Buffalo Ridge people. Thomas had touched with his kindness. Casseroles, pies, and plates of homemade cookies appeared on her doorstep as if delivered by some compassionate army. She was grateful, though she hardly touched the food. Finally, the day of the funeral arrived. The sky was an endless expanse of cold, muted grey. Snow had melted in patchy drifts, leaving the ground muddy in places. Family members drove in from across the state, hugging Evelyn with hushed condolences. The pastor from Buffalo Ridge's small chapel stood by, softly reciting prayers and scriptures. A group of ranch hands and neighbors gathered around in thick coats, their breath steaming in the frosty air. Some men wore hats pressed to their chests. The women dabbed at tears with handkerchiefs. Evelyn stood at the center of it all, by the coffin. It was a plain pine box, nothing fancy, exactly what Thomas would have wanted. She had chosen a spot beneath the tall oak tree, overlooking a field where the horses often grazed. A part of her found comfort in knowing he would rest near the land he loved. Someone retrieved Magnolia from the barn. The old mare had spent the last few days pacing in her stall, seemingly unsettled without Thomas's gentle presence. Evelyn thought it fitting that Magnolia be there, to say goodbye in her own way. The horse, guided by Carl Bishop, approached slowly, her ears flicking at the subdued murmurs of the gathered crowd. She lowered her muzzle to the coffin, sniffing as if perplexed by the wooden box. Evelyn's heart clenched. Magnolia's presence conjured memories of her father's broad hands, stroking the horse's mane, his laughter echoing in the barn. Tears welled up as she realized those moments were now gone, sealed behind a coffin lid. The pastor began to speak. He talked of Thomas's generosity, of the kindness he had shown the town, of the love he had for his daughter and the land. Evelyn tried to focus on the words, but her mind drifted. She was remembering the last conversation she and her father had, the promise she'd made. She would keep Skyward Oaks alive. She would plant the orchard he had dreamed of. She would ride Magnolia across the land in the early morning, as he once did. But tragedy has a way of compounding itself in unimaginable ways. As if the heartbreak of the day weren't enough, a sudden movement broke the funeral's solemn atmosphere. Magnolia jerked her head up, spooked by the snapping of a nearby branch or the rustle of someone's coat. No one could ever say for sure. Carl tried to steady her, but the mare pulled free, rearing slightly in panic. Her hooves clapped the ground heavily. In a horrifying instant, the horse began to tread dangerously close to the coffin. Gasps rippled through the mourners. Several hands reached out to grab Magnolia's reins, but before anyone could stop her, she stumbled sideways, her hind leg striking the top of the wooden box. A sickening crack echoed in the chilly air as the pine lid caved beneath the weight. Time seemed to freeze, as if the entire world paused to witness this devastation. The lid splintered, revealing a glimpse of Thomas's still form. An anguish cry ripped from someone's throat. Maybe it was Evelyn's, maybe it was a neighbor's. The impact of the moment was so raw, so unbearably jarring, that a collective wave of grief crashed over everyone. Some turned away, hands clamped over their mouths. Others stepped forward with trembling arms, trying to cover the break, to maintain any shred of dignity. Magnolia let out a frightened whinny, her eyes rolling white. Evelyn felt as though she'd been punched in the chest, her lungs emptying of air in one brutal exhale. She wanted to scream, to push everyone aside and shield her father from this final insult. She wanted to gather up the broken pieces of the coffin and hold them together, as if that could erase the nightmare unfolding before her eyes. But she stood petrified, tears coursing down her cheeks, her mind unable to process the cruelty of this moment. They finally managed to calm Magnolia, guiding her away from the shattered coffin. The pastor, swallowing back his shock, muttered a prayer under his breath. Carl and a few others scrambled to right the lid, piecing together the splintered wood as best they could. Yet the damage was done. The raw wound of grief tore wider with the sight of Thomas's body exposed to the cold air. Wails of heartbreak filled the clearing under the oak tree. Even the wind seemed to moan, as though nature itself lamented the cruelty of it all. Evelyn, trembling from head to toe, approached the coffin with careful steps. She reached out, pressing her hand to the split wood, then slowly covered her father's face with the cloth that had partially come loose. Around her, sobs echoed. Some men removed their hats, heads bowed in shared despair. Women reached for tissues, eyes brimming with tears. Even children, who barely understood the gravity of the situation, clung to their mother's skirts with wide, fearful eyes. Everyone was crying. In that moment, Evelyn felt her last shred of composure slip away. She sank to her knees, burying her face in her hands. Her grief was no longer something she could contain. It came pouring out in wrenching sobs that left her gasping for breath. Through her tears, she vaguely felt warm arms wrapping around her neighbors, family, friends forming a circle of support. It was a wordless expression of communal sorrow and love, a tapestry of people bound together by respect for a man who had given them so much. When the chaos subsided, they found a spare wooden panel to cover the coffin. A few men gently lowered it into the ground. The pastor, voice unsteady, finished the service. And so Thomas Walker was laid to rest amid heartbreak so profound that it left even the wind silent. Evelyn remained at the graveside long after everyone else had left, her tears mingling with the cold earth. Magnolia stood at a distance, head bowed as if in penance. Evelyn patted the mare's neck when she finally found the strength to stand. Magnolia responded with a soft whicker, pressing her muzzle into Evelyn's shoulder. Whether the horse knew the depth of what she had done was uncertain, but her sorrow seemed genuine. In the annals of Buffalo Ridge's quiet history, this funeral would be recounted for years. The day a horse, spooked by grief and circumstance, broke the lid of a good man's coffin, forcing every witness to confront the fragility of their hearts. The days after Thomas's funeral were a haze of numbness for Evelyn. She oscillated between rage and sorrow, guilt and regret, longing and helplessness. A strange hush enveloped the ranch. The corners of every room felt hollow, as though her father's absence was a tangible void. Photographs of him seemed to watch her, and she couldn't shake the image of his coffin's shattered lid. She avoided people for a while, even neighbors who offered well-intentioned condolences. She wanted solitude to process the avalanche of grief. She visited her father's grave every morning, whispering apologies and confessions to the earth, as though he might hear her somehow. The oak tree's bare branches swayed, offering no words of comfort, only a lonely rustling in the wind. Carl Bishop stepped in unasked, ensuring the livestock remained tended, the fences repaired, the feed supply stocked. He also guided Magnolia's care, giving Evelyn space to grieve. But after a couple of weeks, Evelyn realized she couldn't stay in this suspended state forever. She had promised her father she'd carry on. The ranch needed her, and, ironically, the ranch was all she had left of him. One grey morning, she rose before the sun, forcing herself to follow the old routine, feed the horses, muck the stalls, check the water troughs. Each chore was an echo of Thomas's teachings. She remembered his voice instructing her on how to stack bales properly, how to calm a frightened horse, how to tend a wound. Doing these tasks without him felt like walking through a dream, but she pressed on. She also took time to visit Magnolia, who had been unsettled since the funeral. The mare pawed the ground anxiously whenever Evelyn approached. It was as if Magnolia sensed Evelyn's tumultuous emotions, grief tinged with an unspoken resentment. Though Evelyn knew logically the horse wasn't to blame, Magnolia had been spooked. Her heart still clenched whenever she thought of that coffin lid breaking. Slowly, she approached the mare's stall, letting Magnolia sniff her hands before stroking her neck. "It's okay, girl," she murmured, even if part of her still felt otherwise. Magnolia nickered, her warm breath ghosting over Evelyn's sleeves. In that moment, Evelyn recalled the comfort Magnolia had provided through all her childhood heartbreak. She wasn't an animal to resent, she was a friend still offering solace. The ranch's financial difficulties hadn't disappeared with Thomas's death. In fact, they'd intensified. Medical bills were piling up, and while neighbors helped, the day-to-day expenses demanded immediate attention. Evelyn considered selling off a portion of the land or some of the livestock to keep the rest afloat. But a promise was a promise. She had told her father she wouldn't abandon the ranch or the horses unless it was for something that truly mattered. Still, she knew she had to survive. She started searching for alternative income streams, perhaps opening the ranch for horseback riding lessons, or renting out part of the land for cattle grazing to bigger ranches in the region. While sifting through paperwork in her father's old desk, she came across a small notebook. Inside were sketches, plans, and lists, Thomas's hopes for the ranch's future. One page, dog-eared and smudged, bore the title Orchard. Beneath that, he had written a rough plan for planting apple trees. There were notes about which varieties grow best in Wyoming's climate, how to protect them from frost, and how orchard tours might bring in extra revenue. It was like a gentle whisper from beyond the grave, telling Evelyn to keep dreaming. She remembered how he pressed a sketch of that orchard into her hand. A wave of emotion washed over her sadness. Yes, but also a new ember of determination. She thought about that orchard day and night. Could it actually work? She knew next to nothing about large-scale fruit farming. She would need capital to invest, tools, irrigation, fencing to keep animals from devouring the young saplings. But the more she mulled it over, the more it felt like a piece of Thomas that she could bring to life. It wouldn't replace him, nothing ever could, but it might help her heal and help the ranch survive. In a moment of clarity, she decided to reach out for advice. The local community college in Sheridan offered agricultural courses. There was also a horticulture extension office that might provide guidance. She swallowed her pride, overcame her reclusive grief, and made calls. She set up appointments. And to her surprise, people were eager to help. One professor agreed to visit the ranch to evaluate the land for an orchard. Another contact offered to assist with the application for a small agricultural grant. During this time, Magnolia became Evelyn's stalwart companion once more. The bond they had forged was tested but not broken. Every afternoon, Evelyn saddled Magnolia and rode out across the ranch to the place she envisioned for the orchard. She would sit on a gentle slope, letting the breeze ruffle her hair, and imagine rows of blossoming trees. A place of renewal, a place of peace, maybe even a place where families could come, pick apples, share stories, and connect with a legacy that went beyond her father's death. Yet every so often, the funeral scene replayed in her mind with unsettling vividness. She would hear the crack of wood, the collective gasp, feel the horror, the shame, the despair. Her therapist, she had started seeing one after repeated nightmares, told her that trauma had a way of clinging to the mind like barbed wire. With time and introspection, it could be lessened, though never fully erased. The therapist encouraged her to talk about Thomas, to honor his memory by living, not just existing. Forgiveness is part of healing, he had said. Forgiveness for yourself, for the horse, for the random sequence of events that can bring heartbreak. Evelyn tried. She wasn't always successful. There were days she lashed out, yelling at Magnolia for spooking at a simple wind gust, or cursing the endless bills that threatened to drown her. But then she'd recall her father's words, "Life out here is tough, Evie, but being tough don't mean you can't be kind." She would take a deep breath, look into Magnolia's trusting eyes, and feel a softened ache rather than raw agony. The mare would gently nuzzle her shoulder, and in that silent exchange, Evelyn found enough grace to keep going. As winter thawed into a timid spring, green shoots emerged across the ranch. Birds began to return, filling the mornings with their songs. That same oak tree by Thomas's grave sprouted fresh leaves, a living symbol of renewal. Evelyn spent time there, pulling weeds, laying fresh flowers at his marker, sometimes just sitting in silence, letting the warmth of the sunlight wash over her. She had begun to understand that grief was not something to be rushed. Like a seed in the earth, it needed time and tending before it could blossom into understanding or acceptance. Soon she would meet with the horticulture professor who had promised to help her map out the orchard. If everything went well, she might have seedlings in the ground by the following spring. The idea both excited and terrified her. It was an endeavor that carried Thomas's spirit, and success was far from guaranteed. But she had to try. She owed it to him, to herself, and to the ranch that had nurtured her every dream. When Professor Gabriella Saunders from Sheridan Community College arrived, she was a whirlwind of energy in a battered pickup truck. Dressed in jeans, hiking boots, and a flannel shirt, she greeted Evelyn with a warm handshake. "So this is Skyward Oaks," she said, glancing around at the undulating fields and the weathered barn. "It's beautiful. You've got quite a canvas to work with." Evelyn led Gabriella on a tour. They rode in a small ATV across the ranch, stopping by the patch of land Evelyn envisioned for the orchard. It was on a gentle slope, with a nearby creek that could be diverted for irrigation if needed. Gabriella took soil samples, measured the slope, and asked about local wildlife that might pose threats. As they worked, Magnolia grazed nearby, occasionally flicking her ears at their conversation. "Your father was onto something with these soil conditions," Gabriella remarked, studying the dusty pinkish sample in a small jar. "Not perfect, but workable with some amendments. Also, you'll need deer fencing big time. They'll mow down your saplings as soon as they sprout." She grinned, as though the challenge energized her. Evelyn found herself smiling back, despite the nerves fluttering in her stomach. "I'm ready to learn," she said. "I'm not an expert, but I'm committed." "Well, that's half the battle," the professor replied. She walked the perimeter, took notes, and gave Evelyn a quick primer on orchard management rootstocks, pollination, pest control, orchard spacing. The list of tasks was daunting, but something about Gabriella's optimism was contagious. By the end of the tour, Evelyn felt both exhausted and invigorated. They concluded the day in the ranch house kitchen, poring over more details. "There's a state grant that could help pay for infrastructure, fencing, irrigation, maybe a portion of the saplings," Gabriella explained. "I'll help you apply, but it'll require some business planning on your end. You'll have to show a path to profitability. Maybe orchard tours, an on-site farm stand, that kind of thing." Evelyn nodded, scribbling notes in a spiral notebook. She imagined families wandering under the apple blossoms, children picking fruit, the ranch echoing with laughter instead of sadness. The mental image caught her off guard. She realized she hadn't pictured joy like that in a long time. The orchard was becoming more than a source of income. It was a vessel for hope. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn dove headfirst into research. She pored over library books on horticulture, watched online tutorials on pruning and grafting techniques, and even attended a weekend workshop on sustainable farming. Each new piece of knowledge felt like a step forward, a tribute to her father's memory. Meanwhile, the ranch needed her full attention. The horses required daily care, the fences needed patching, and the cattle that grazed part of the land needed checking. She learned the delicate art of balancing the old ways with the new dream. Her relationship with Magnolia evolved too. Slowly, the guilt and anger she'd harbored began to dissipate. Every evening, she made it a point to groom the mare thoroughly, speaking softly about her day. "We're doing this together, girl," she would say, brushing Magnolia's mane until it shone. The horse snorted softly, as if agreeing. The nightmares of the funeral still visited, but less frequently. Time was weaving a balm around that wound, though it remained tender. Carl Bishop remained a faithful ally. He helped with tasks around the ranch, taught Evelyn how to weld broken gates, and even accompanied her to the county office to finalize the funeral documentation for Thomas's burial. "I'd do just about anything for that man," he said once, referencing Thomas. And for his girl, too. The paternal warmth in his voice was a reminder that not all fatherly presences were gone from her life. Others in Buffalo Ridge also stepped up in small ways, dropping off feed at bulk discounts or lending a hand with mechanical repairs. In a community like theirs, even the unspoken vow to help a neighbor carried a certain sacredness. Yet the orchard project was not without its hurdles. Costs spiraled when they factored in fencing, irrigation piping, and the premium price for disease-resistant saplings. The grant application was a labyrinth of paperwork, with strict deadlines and specifications, and the ranch's daily expenses had not magically evaporated. Evelyn contemplated part-time work in town, but the ranch already consumed her full attention. Stress sometimes weighed on her like a lead blanket, pressing against her chest until she struggled to breathe. Gabriella returned for follow-up visits, offering technical support and moral encouragement. "I know it seems overwhelming," she told Evelyn one afternoon as they hiked to check soil moisture levels. "But establishing an orchard is a marathon, not a sprint, and as you adapt, it'll get easier." She paused, looking across the rolling hills. "You know, your father's story, his kindness, how he helped this community, people haven't forgotten. Once you break ground, I suspect you'll have plenty of volunteers. Folks here want to be part of something hopeful, especially after all that's happened." Evelyn swallowed hard, remembering the funeral. For a moment, she was back in that heart-wrenching scene, hearing the crack of wood, feeling the collective gasp. She closed her eyes, grounding herself in the present moment, the scent of warm earth and budding grass. "Hope," she repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. Yes, that's what she wanted, to transform heartbreak into something beautiful, to plant seeds of renewal where sorrow once reigned. As spring matured, the orchard site began to take shape. A local fencing company, run by a family friend, offered discounted rates. Carl and a few ranch hands dug post holes. Evelyn spent hours marking rows and measuring distances for the future trees. When the saplings arrived, dozens of them, in tall cardboard boxes, her heart pounded with a mingled sense of awe and fear. Each fragile shoot was a testament to Thomas's dream. She handled them with reverence, carefully placing them in a temporary nursery she had prepared near the barn until the ground was ready. Finally, on a day that dawned bright and clear, they began planting. Gabriella was there, knee-deep in soil, showing Evelyn how to spread the roots, how to gently pack the earth. Volunteers from Buffalo Ridge arrived, folks who had once felt the impact of Thomas's generosity. Some had borrowed his truck, others had been taught how to ride by him. They arrived with tools and gloves, with kind smiles that said, "We believe in you." As each sapling was placed into the ground, Evelyn felt a mixture of sadness and joy. Sadness because Thomas was not there to see his dream take root. Joy because she was finally breathing life into his plans, forging a future that honored him. Every tree planted was like a promise that life goes on. The orchard was, in many ways, a metaphor for her own journey through grief. Growth demanded patience and nurture, and sometimes it meant facing harsh seasons before blossoms appeared. They worked until the sun sank low, painting the Wyoming sky in hues of pink and orange. The orchard rose looked modest saplings, barely taller than her waist, but the potential thrummed like an unspoken melody in the air. When the last tree was planted, the volunteers gathered in a circle, smiling and exchanging good-natured banter. Someone suggested they name the orchard in Thomas's memory. Thomas's Grove, they proposed. Evelyn, tears glistening in her eyes, nodded in agreement. Exhausted yet elated, she stood at the highest point of the orchard, gazing down at the rows of young trees. The hush of evening enveloped her, and she swore she felt her father's presence, an intangible warmth in the breeze, a silent reassurance that he approved. Magnolia nickered from a distance, as if calling her to head back to the barn for the night. And so a new chapter began. Though the orchard wouldn't bear fruit for years, the act of planting was itself a victory. The ranch had begun to transform from a place of recent tragedy into a space of renewal. Months rolled into years. The orchard demanded its share of time and sweat. Early frosts threatened the saplings, pests found their way past the fencing, and irrigation lines occasionally sprung leaks. But Evelyn tackled each setback with grit and a determination forged in the crucible of her father's loss. Over time, the trees established themselves, leaves unfurling in spring and shimmering in the sun. Each passing season brought them closer to fruition. By the orchard's second spring, delicate blossoms emerged, a swirl of pale pink and white that made Evelyn's heart flutter. "It's happening," she whispered, running a fingertip across the petals. They were fleeting but enchanting, a sign that life was bursting forth on this land again. Just as Gabriella had predicted, Buffalo Ridge rallied around the orchard project. Families visited on weekends, some just to walk through the rows of young trees, others offering help with weeding and pest control. A sense of community pride sparked around Thomas's Grove. People would bring their children, recounting anecdotes of how Thomas once helped them fix a broken fence, or how he'd given riding lessons at no cost. Evelyn, shy by nature, found herself learning how to host visitors. In doing so, she grew more comfortable sharing her story, both the sorrow of her father's funeral and the hope she now planted in his name. Meanwhile, the ranch continued its normal cycle. Evelyn cared for the horses, with Magnolia aging gracefully. The mare's muzzle had begun to grey, but her eyes still held that soulful kindness. Evelyn occasionally guided children's rides on Magnolia, watching them giggle with delight as they led the gentle mare around. In those innocent smiles, she saw the echoes of her younger self, perched on Magnolia's back under Thomas's watchful gaze. On a bright autumn morning, almost 3 years after Thomas's passing, Evelyn woke to find the orchard speckled with tiny round apples. They weren't large or perfectly shaped, some were lopsided, others pecked by birds, but they were undeniably apples. She picked one, biting into it. The taste was tart yet sweet, bursting with the promise of future harvests. Tears welled in her eyes, unbidden but welcome. She had kept her promise. The orchard, her father's dream, was alive and bearing fruit. That afternoon she organized a small harvest gathering. Children scampered between rows, plucking the modest fruit, while parents kept a watchful eye. Evelyn enlisted Carl Bishop to barbecue some burgers and hot dogs, turning the day into an impromptu festival. Even Gabriella made the trip out, strolling the orchard with a grin. "This is just the beginning," she said, patting Evelyn on the back. As dusk settled, the group gathered around a makeshift fire pit, roasting marshmallows. Someone played guitar, and a few folks sang along to old country tunes. In that circle of warmth, Evelyn felt a profound sense of belonging. A feeling that this was not just her ranch, but a place where people could come together to find solace, joy, and community. When the last embers glowed, Carl raised a toast with his paper cup of cider. To Thomas, he said, voice trembling slightly, he'd be proud of what's been done here. And to Evelyn for carrying his light. All around the circle, cups clinked, tears shimmered, and hearts quietly honored the man who had given this ranch its soul. That night, Evelyn visited the oak tree where Thomas was buried. She brought a few of the orchard's earliest apples, placing them gently by the grave marker. The moonlight silvered the grass. She took a deep breath, letting memories flow: her father's laugh, his guiding hands, the way he said her name with unspoken love. She felt no anger now, no bitterness at the funeral's tragic climax. Time had weathered that pain into a softer ache. Grief had found its place alongside gratitude. She knelt by his grave, pressing her palm to the earth. "Thank you," she whispered. "You taught me to be strong, to love the land, to believe in what seems impossible. I hope you can see this orchard, Dad. It's for you." Her tears splashed onto the soil, each drop a mingling of sorrow and triumph. In the end, life had continued forward, carrying her along with it. The horse that broke the coffin lid had once symbolized heartbreak, but Magnolia now stood as an emblem of resilience. The orchard, once a mere scribble in Thomas's notebook, now thrived with blossoms and fruit. And Evelyn, no longer the frightened, grief-stricken girl, had emerged as a woman anchored by purpose. She rose, gazing out over the moonlit ranch. The silhouette of apple trees stretched across the horizon, each trunk a pillar of silent testimony. She smiled. Perhaps, in another year, the harvest would double. Perhaps families would flock in greater numbers, forging new memories among the rows. Whatever the future held, Evelyn stood ready. She had learned that growth comes in its own season, that love endures loss, and that the land has a way of absorbing both tears and dreams. Yet some nights when the wind swept low across the fields, she still heard the echo of splintering wood, a reminder of how quickly life can break. It was a reminder to cherish each fragile moment, to plant seeds of hope where the soil of sorrow once lay barren. And as the orchard flourished, so did she, guided by the quiet conviction that even in life's most heart-wrenching moments, one could find the seeds of rebirth. As the years roll on, Evelyn and Magnolia continue tending to Thomas's grove, welcoming families who wander among the blossoming rows with laughter and curiosity. The apple trees stand as living monuments to a promise kept and a legacy carried forward. Every harvest brings a fresh reminder that from life's deepest sorrows, new beginnings can and do emerge. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey of resilience, connection, and personal growth. If you found inspiration in Evelyn's story, please consider showing your support, like this video, share it with someone who might find hope in these words, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the transformative power of the human spirit. Your engagement helps our community grow, allowing us to share even more narratives that warm the heart and remind us of our boundless capacity to heal and thrive.